This month, we are talking about doing good and not just doing good, but really doing good. What's the difference between doing good and really doing good? The first difference which we look at in the message last week, Have a Heart, is that we are really doing good only if we do it out of a good heart. If you help the needy out of guilt, if you give money wanting to show off, or if you perform charitable works hoping to improve your spiritual standing or karma, what you do may benefit the recipients practically, but it is not really doing good because your motivation was driven or corrupted by selfishness and pride. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, what goes on inside matters even more because God is not impressed by outward shows of goodness. He's concerned about the kind of person we really are. And it's an insult to God to think that we can bribe Him with our good deeds or to believe that we can gain any spiritual merit by our performance. Today, we look at the second difference between doing good and really doing good. It is this: you are really doing good only if you really do it. It doesn't matter how much you think about doing good. It doesn't matter how much you know about doing good. It doesn't matter how many sermons you hear about doing good. You are not really doing good until you take concrete action. Really doing good requires you to lend a hand. In the Bible, the prophet Isaiah addressed a people who were outwardly very spiritual. Isaiah said they sought the Lord day after day. They appeared very eager to know God's ways. They longed for God to draw near to them. They humbled themselves before God. And one sign of their religious piety was that they fasted regularly. I mean, come on, guys, how many of you fast regularly? And yet, for all that, they could not experience God's presence or power. Why not? The answer is found in Isaiah chapter 58, starting from verse 5, which says, "Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is this what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and He will say, 'Here I am.'" Let me now draw 3 lessons from this passage about doing good. Number 1, doing good is sharing God's blessings. Why did God not respond to the Israelites despite their efforts to seek Him and worship Him? Why was He not happy with their sacrifices and fasting? The reason is that you cannot get your vertical relationship right with God if you're not getting your horizontal relationships right with your fellow human beings. And how does God want us to get our horizontal relationships right? Not just by having fellowship with people who are like ourselves or very comfortable and affluent. No, Isaiah 58 verse 7 tells us what God requires of us again. Verse 7 again, "Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood?" We cannot be right with God if we are not actively helping the poor and needy by sharing good things with them. We cannot expect God to be pleased with us just because we are doing all the right things in church and in our own personal lives. God is also intensely interested in whether we are really doing good by sharing with those who are disadvantaged and deprived. Again, Christianity gives us 2 unique perspectives about this. Isaiah refers to the needy as your own flesh and blood. Why should we help others and share with them? Today, there is a lot of talk about treating people equally. But why should we do that? Why should you share your hard-earned wealth with those who have not been as smart or as diligent as you? Why should you not take advantage of your resources to advance and preserve your own position? What moral basis is there to claim that people should all be treated equally? The Bible's answer is that we are all created equal, that our intrinsic worth is based on the fact that we are all created in God's image. When God created the first humans, He did not differentiate between races or skin color or socio-economic status. God made only one differentiation, in fact. He made them male and female. And to emphasize that both genders have equal worth, the Bible says both male and female were equally created in God's image. We are all part of the family of Adam and Eve. Every human being is therefore our own flesh and blood. Every human therefore deserves to be treated with the same dignity and accorded the same worth. That's why if we see someone else in need and turn away from them, God will also turn away from us. The second reason the Bible gives us for why we ought to share is that, contrary to what most of us think, what we have is not really ours anyway. In fact, this is one of the most frequent reminders that God gave in the Bible. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 18 to 19, it says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from that. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." God was telling the Israelites to remember that everything they have was a purely gracious gift from His hand. If not for the fact that He delivered them out of slavery in Egypt, they would not be enjoying the good life. They would not be any better off than the people they were now supposed to help. Now, it's important for us to internalize this truth, especially because we have been raised in a meritocratic culture. And we feel a deep-seated belief that people get what they deserve. We tend, therefore, to assume that people who are poor and needy, because they are lazy, we are suspicious of people asking for handouts. Now, it is true that too much welfare can destroy people's will to work. And that's why even in this passage, God didn't tell the landowners to just give away their produce to the needy, but to leave part of their field unharvested. The poor were to be provided for, but they had to do their own harvesting. Those who can were expected to work for their own living as well. What the Bible emphasizes is that ultimately, it is God who gives us even the ability to work and to make wealth. If you are smarter or more hardworking or more talented or more good-looking, or if you have good parents, so that you have an advantage over other people, that's purely because God blessed you for all those things. The truth is that there are many places in the world today, even today, if you were born there, you would not have achieved what you now have. In other words, everything you have is a result of God's generosity towards you. Moreover, the Bible stresses that they don't really belong to you. They really belong to God who has entrusted them to you. God therefore expects that you not hoard His blessings selfishly, but share them with others who have less than you. You have been no better than they, but for the grace of God. Lesson number 2 is this. Doing good is a matter of justice. The conventional view of charity is that it is something I choose to do if I feel generous. I do it out of the kindness of my heart and because not because I have to, but because I really want to do it. That's also why we use the word volunteer when people help out to do charitable things. A volunteer is basically a person who is under no obligation. He's free not to do it. We think of charity as going over and beyond our duty. It is a good but optional thing to do. The Bible, however, provides us with a radically different view about doing good. The Bible requires helping the needy as a matter of justice, meaning that if we fail to do so, we are not merely being uncaring or stingy, we are actually guilty of injustice. Going back to Isaiah 58 at verse 6, God says, "Is this not the kind of fasting I've chosen? to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. At first sight, you may think that Isaiah is talking about two different things in verses 6 and 7. He seems to be talking about two failings of the people. First, practicing injustice in verse 6, and then failing to help the needy in verse 7. But when you examine many other similar Bible passages, you find that they all both refer to the same thing. Failing to do good is injustice in God's sight. Now, we all feel strongly about justice, don't we? But let me ask you, what comes to your mind when you think about the word justice or the word injustice? We usually associate them with punishment for wrongdoing. If an innocent person is punished, that's injustice. Conversely, if a murderer or rapist is duly punished, we say justice has been done. Recently there's been a lot of unhappiness online over sentences meted out to molesters and peeping toms, and many people protested that the court's punishment was not severe enough. They considered that an injustice. So we all tend to construe justice very much in punitive terms, punishment. The Bible does not define justice in such a narrow way. In the Bible, justice means giving people what is rightly due to them, whether good or bad. If a wrongdoer gets off scot-free or too lightly, we feel upset because, it's unjust. In the same way, God gets upset when we fail to help the needy because we're not giving them what is due to them. God considers that an act of injustice, meaning we are under legal obligation to help those who are needy. We owe it to them as a matter of justice. Now, I can't go through all the times that the Bible links doing good directly with justice, but here's one. Zechariah chapter 7 verse 9 says, "This is what the Lord Almighty said, administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another." And then verse 10 says, "Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner, or the poor." This verse lists the four main groups that the Bible repeatedly tells the people to help: widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor. What all four have in common is that in their culture, such people not only have limited means to meet their own needs, they are also in a disadvantageous and vulnerable position. They usually have no ability to stand up for themselves or to help themselves even compared to ordinary people. God mentions them again and again. He is obviously highly sensitive to the plight of needy people, and hence He's also very mindful of how we treat them. In other words, injustice does not occur only when we cheat or oppress the poor. Injustice is done when we have no concern for them and turn a blind eye to their needs. Doing good is not just something for nice and noble people to do. We are all under legal and moral obligation to alleviate suffering and deprivation. It is only when we understand that doing good is a matter of justice that we can make sense of much of what the Bible says. That's how we can understand the story of the rich man and Lazarus told by Jesus in Luke chapter 16. The rich man lived in lavish luxury, while Lazarus, the poor beggar, sat outside his gate. The rich man ended up in hell, while Lazarus went to heaven. Now, Jesus is of course not saying that if you're rich, you go to hell. If you're poor, you go to heaven. Instead, the rich man was held accountable for failing to share God's blessings with Lazarus. Jesus does not say that the rich man ill-treated Lazarus in any way. His sin was that he simply ignored Lazarus. But such indifference amounts to injustice, which God hates. That is also the only way we can understand the story of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. Jesus said that when He eventually returns and judges the whole world, all those who have refused to help the poor and the needy will be sent to a place of everlasting torment. Why would doing good or failing to do good be the yardstick that Jesus judges by? Because failing to do good is not just being unkind or uncaring. It is a grave act of injustice that God will not tolerate. Doing good is not just good to do. Doing good is a matter of justice. Finally, lesson number 3. Doing good requires us to act. When I evaluate the 40 years of church life that I've been through, one thing that stood out very clearly is that we Protestant Christians have by and large been big on preaching the good news, but when it came to doing good works, we were pathetic, or rather apathetic. We were passionate about saving people's souls, but we were not too interested in their physical conditions. We had trained our people well to seek God, but we had not sent them out to serve the world. Churches spent millions on facilities for worship, but we do relatively little for the poor and the needy. And then we wonder, why doesn't God show up more powerfully and obviously in our midst? We are like the people in Isaiah 58, verse 3, when they ask, why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Why do most Protestant Christians lag so far behind Roman Catholics and many other religions when it comes to doing good? A large part of the reason is historical. In the 1960s, many churches moved away from preaching the gospel to doing good works. They downplayed the need to have genuine faith and a personal relationship with God, focusing instead on a social gospel of helping the poor and needy. In reaction to that, many other churches who call themselves evangelicals shifted from doing good works to emphasizing individual spirituality, the cultivation of the inner life, and preaching about eternal salvation. Most of us grew up in the evangelical tradition without knowing the larger forces driving it, without even knowing the term. And when we started our own church, we simply modeled it after what we ourselves have experienced. We largely ignored the Bible's commands to do good. However, when we read the Bible without the filter of our church experience, it becomes so clear that it is not enough for us just to be biblically knowledgeable and correct. We also need to act to help the needy. We are not really doing good unless we are really taking concrete action. For example, the Bible says this very bluntly in James chapter 2, verse 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if some claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. It is possible to fall into the error of thinking that doing good works is what really saves us. But it is equally possible to assume that we have been saved simply by believing. We call it salvation by faith. But James says that there is no genuine faith unless it is a faith that motivates us to really do good. The test of faith is not whether you have said the sinner's prayer or if you understood the biblical basis for salvation. It is not whether you've been baptized. It is not whether you feel close to God when you worship or when you pray. The first test of faith is whether it moves you to action in serving the poor. Now, as a local church, we have taken several steps in that right direction. We started a bursary scheme to help needy students in church and in the community. We also set up Brighton Connection to serve the community. But those are only small steps, and we must resolve to do a lot more. The second part of our vision statement as a church is to be a positive influence on society. For that to become a reality, we need to go beyond a vision statement. We need to take concrete action. We need to really do good. So, how can we get started? Let me give you some suggestions. Number one, budget for the needy. Budget intentionally for the needy. I recently learned to my horror that there are about 250,000 people in Singapore who can be classified as the absolute poor, meaning they do not have enough for food, shelter, clothing, and other basic necessities of life. If that number seems unrealistically high to you, as it did to me, it sadly reveals how we move only among people like ourselves, while there is a large number of people out there around us who are struggling from day to day. We are in danger of becoming like the rich man who ignored the needs of Lazarus living just outside his house. In the light of this, we must ask ourselves how we allocate our expenditures. Can we go on spending on things like our holidays, our gadgets, our gym memberships, our lattes and bubble tea, our sticks, wines, and Mount Shanwang durian if we give nothing or next to nothing to the poor? Now, it is not wrong to enjoy all those things, but they are all luxuries, not necessities. As I've suggested before, let's allocate at least an equal portion of our money for charity as for luxury. But whatever it is, let's be intentional about setting aside funds for doing good. Second thing you can do is to go and find out the needs. Find out the needs. There was a period when our church actively reached out to the community, knocking on doors, entering people's homes. It was an eye-opener to see how some Singaporeans live. My wife and I, we met a family where a grandmother was taking care of 4 young grandchildren by herself. 2 of them belonged to her son, who had gone to jail, and their mother had remarried and abandoned them. Another 2 belonged to another son, who had divorced, remarried, and similarly abandoned his children. We also met another couple who were fishmongers. They had 3 children, and all of them were way behind in their schooling. But they could not afford to do anything about it. And my wife and I were so disturbed by the whole situation that we hired a tuition teacher to go to their house to help them with their schoolwork. I also visited a woman whose husband had left her. She suffered from depression and had 7 children, none of whom had finished secondary school. It's virtually impossible for families in such circumstances to break out of that poverty cycle without lots of help and intervention. When I went to the neighborhood provision shop to buy a drink, I was curious because I saw rice being sold in small little plastic bags. I mean, we usually buy rice in 5 or 10 kilogram sacks. And then it struck me that the people staying there could only afford several hundred grams of rice at any one time. They were literally living hand to mouth. It was mind-boggling. It was life-changing. My point is that we don't even realize such people exist. But ignorance is no excuse. We need to find out about the needs of those around us so that we can act. Recently, I watched a presentation on YouTube by Yo Lam Keong, former chief economist at the GIC. It was about poverty in Singapore, and it powerfully changed the way I think as it opened my eyes to the needs of the poor in Singapore. It was hosted by the Progress Singapore Party, but it was surprisingly non-political. I really urge you to Google it and watch it to educate yourself about the needs of the poor in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. In the light of what the Bible says, we ought to intentionally learn about the needs of our fellow citizens so that we can act on them. The third thing we can do is to contribute our time and talent. Volunteer. Singapore does not have a strong culture of volunteerism. Most people don't volunteer. We know that for a fact, except maybe to get their children into the primary school of their choice or to fulfill their school curriculum requirements. Now, as a church, we ought to be different. And I urge all of you to seriously consider contributing part of your time to help out with a charity or a good cause. Not to get something out of it, but to align yourself with God's heart. I'm so thankful for the church members who volunteer, who have been volunteering at Brighton Connection. I hope to see more of you get involved there. And next week, I will share about how we are going to allocate $500,000 out of what we have collected from the Gift to the King offering to help the poor. Part of it will go towards helping the needy residents in MacPherson Estate. However, we don't just want to give away money. We want to build relationships and make friends as well. I will explain to you how you can volunteer to be involved to help Brighton Connection bless the community next week. When I decided to do this series almost a year ago, I could not have foreseen the situation that the world would be in today as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it has turned out, I think, to be especially timely, divinely timely. The full effects of the economic impact will be increasingly felt in the days ahead. There's going to be a lot more pain. In a time like this, God is calling on us to share His blessings with the needy. He's calling us to do justice, which is about giving practical help to the poor and vulnerable. We owe it to them. As we celebrate National Day, we are thankful that God has placed us in this blessed and prosperous land. Even in the midst of a raging global pandemic, most of us are doing well. We are not just lucky. We are not just clever. We have been graciously blessed, and we are called to be a blessing to others. So let's ask God to come and give us a heart for those He is most concerned about. But let's not stop at praying. Let's seriously consider how we can act to make a difference, individually and collectively as a church. Let's become a people who really do good by lending a hand.